I'm Alan Wardis, and you're listening to Think Radio.
My job wasn't to bring in my idea of what needed to be done, but to sit humbly and say, what do you all need and how can I participate?
That's Ethan White, Peace Corps veteran and a student in the Western State Colorado University Master of Environmental Management program. He's got an ambitious plan to study mountain communities throughout North and Central America, but to tell the whole story of what it means to live there. Stay tuned for another great conversation on this episode of Think Radio.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison's locally owned hometown newspaper, and by listeners like you. To find out how you can become a Think Radio supporter, visit kbut.org.
Ethan, thanks for stopping by. Looking forward to this conversation.
Absolutely.
You're a student
Yep.
at Western State Colorado University in the Master of Environmental Management program. And you've got a really interesting project going on. But before we get to that, I'd love to hear a little bit about how you came to be here. What path brought
Gunnison,
you?
here in
well,
Gunnison.
in Gunnison and doing what you're doing.
Yeah, sure. So graduated with my undergrad out in Southern Illinois. I was a man's man playing college football, and I got a communication degree because I didn't know what else to do. After that, I really fell in love with youth development. So AmeriCorps Vista for the Boys and Girls Club in Lawrence. And then I followed that sort of career path down to Fiji in the Peace Corps, working at an all-boys agriculture school. And that really opened my eyes to development, the world of development, what development is, what it is not. I saw Peace Corps volunteers who came in with no financial compensation, essentially, to participate in a community on one end of the spectrum. So real motivated through heart. And then on the other end of the spectrum, some entrepreneurial guys who, for good or for ill, were coming in there with a financial motive. And, Australians or British or Americans. And kind of seeing the huge difference in ways of approaching development.
And so development from the Peace Corps point of view was more about developing what? Human resources or developing systems that at least benefited people?
Yeah. I would say that one of the strongest points of the Peace Corps, one of the things the Peace Corps does best is help you or me develop my own development ethic. What is development? And teaching a Peace Corps volunteer how to do a community assessment, just what's going on in this place, what's important to these people, what are their goals. That was something that, unfortunately, I didn't really get when I was first there, that my job wasn't to bring in my idea of what needed to be done, but to sit humbly and say, what do you all need and how can I participate? Very different.
Well, and so how did you answer that question for yourself? What was your development ethic?
Well, so coming in, I would say largely it would be based around infrastructure. Going into the Peace Corps, I thought, okay, if we can get water, better food, better electricity, on and on,
schools.
Roads, hospitals, everything, then that's development. I don't necessarily disagree with that. I think that's a very limited view. If that's what a community wants, let's move in that direction. But there's, classic examples. If you even now look at the Amazon rainforest, any of the basins there, the watersheds, where a contractor will come in and say, hey, we're going to give you a road, and this is going to give you access to schools and communities and groceries, on and on.
Jobs. Mm-hmm.
And they have no idea what it's going to cost them. The loss of their cultural identity, loss of their land, loss of their privacy. Now it's open to Westerners to come in and explore and whatever else.
Well, and we've learned that roads are fragmenting to habitat and so forth and so on. It creates erosion. So what was your arc like then in Fiji when you first arrived with this idea about infrastructure? How was it that you went about altering that view?
By failing, by a lot of failures. I would, so many times, I still remember, and I laugh about it, all these meetings I would have with these Fijian farmers and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to use this USAID toolkit to design our secession planting for the year. And they'd be like, and they'd sit there and listen kindly, and we'd share drinks, and then nothing would ever happen. And that was another lesson in the culture. Nobody would ever say no. they would say yes, and they just wouldn't
and
do
then
it.
just wander off.
Yeah.
Well, and presumably this toolkit had not taken indigenous wisdom into account.
Well, perhaps in some of the planting there was, but it was still a very Western way of thinking that by producing more, we're doing better, instead of saying, how can we produce more of what you want, which may not be more food. It may not be more eggplant. It may not be more efficient work. What is it that you want?
So you'd have these conversations. These guys would nod and smile and then wander away. What else led to you changing your ideas about how it ought to be done?
Other Peace Corps volunteers who I think were much further ahead of me in this process of creating their development ethic. And maybe coincidentally, maybe not, the older the Peace Corps volunteer was, the less concerned they were about their own view of development, and the more concerned they were with the Fijian, with the locals' view of development. And so having these conversations, oh, I'm so frustrated about this, oh, I'm so frustrated about that. And they would say, well, have you asked the Fijians what they want? And I'd go, what do you mean? You know, why would I ask people what I should be doing in their community? And then you would go, oh,
Wait,
I
what?
just heard myself. That's
Yeah.
insane. Of
Yeah.
course, that's what I should be doing.
It sounds to me like your story is very similar to others that I've heard from Peace Corps volunteers and others who go and do work like that the experience winds up changing you every bit as much as you leave behind any sort of change. Do you agree with that, first
I
of
left
all?
as a totally different person. I don't think I changed any Fijians' lives, which is very much, you know, again, I walked into this experience thinking I'm here to create change and to really, you know, as a savior to these lost peoples, and not in a religious sense and not in a colonial or imperialistic sense, but certainly in this maybe imperial development sense where I'm above
capitalist
reaching
sense
down.
anyway.
Right. I'm the one that has the authority. And I left going, I really don't know much, and you all have changed me forever. I hope I've left something with you.
Well, so quickly, characterize that change. In what way were you a different person when you got back on the airplane than you were when you landed?
I had lost a lot of my, and I think this is a good loss, I had lost a lot of my fire to be an authority. I've always been a very independent, driven person, and that hasn't changed. But in the way I work, I have much less desire to be a person of control and more to be a person of support. How can I help people achieve goals instead of make that goal happen? Which again is maybe not an American persona, if you will.
And yet, do you see any evidence in talking and relating with others who have been through this process and experience that that's shifting? Do you think we're learning something about how to do this?
You mean in like
just
the
in
development
general?
world?
Well, I'm not going to go so far as to say throughout the development world, but are these ideas gaining more traction?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So a cool example is the OECD. They have a Better Life Index and 11 different categories ranging from food to family to leisure and a country. It's for a country scale. A country can go in and shift or weight the value of each of these categories. So while there's still a structure saying these are the categories we're going to rate you in or to assess you in, there is this participatory element to it. Tell us if these categories matter to you.
Yeah, where they can say a road is going to destroy our tradition of X, whatever it is, how we
Right.
get our oxen to market.
Right.
And that matters.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. Well, that does bring us around, I think, to what you're doing now then. Describe to us what it is that you've got in mind. Students in this program have to do real-world projects.
Yep.
The number that's always thrown around, that scary 600 hours
600.
of real-world project.
Which is kind of a funny number because that's only like 3 months of work, of full-time work. So
Yeah, but you're doing other things alongside
true,
it. So,
that's
well,
true.
and as I've heard others point out, that's a minimum.
absolutely.
So it winds up
absolutely.
being more than that.
Yeah, nobody does only 600 hours.
How are you planning to spend your 600 hours?
The capstone of this degree for me, my master's environmental project, is working with Aspen International Mountain Foundation and Telluride Institute. They're two founding partners, two lead partners with Western School of ENVS to build the Mountain Resilience Coalition. This is one of 6 different organizations under the Center for Mountain Transitions that basically says mountains everywhere have something in common, not just the ecology, not just the culture, not just people, maybe a mixture of all of these. And we need to start addressing these mountains as a whole. So under the Center for Mountain Transitions is my project, Mountain Resilience Coalition. This is an organization being developed with Aspen International Mountain Foundation and Telluride Institute to serve the United Nations Mountain Partnership. A lot of different mountain organizations and projects here.
I didn't follow that flow chart exactly, but the word that I kept catching was mountain.
Mountain, absolutely.
And the idea that mountain communities are similar to each other, whether they're in Africa or the Urals or the Caribbean or the Western United States.
Right.
What led to this idea that, wait a minute, we should be treating these communities as a whole rather than separate?
So this was in 2002, and the United Nations recognized that there were some similarities. And actually, this need for a mountain-specific focus or organization was because of the success of islands, by islands communicating and islands sharing solutions to similar problems. So I was in the islands, now I'm in the mountains, and the United Nations Mountain Partnership came out of the islands in a sort of way.
Well, in the wintertime here in the central Rocky Mountains, a little town tucked away up in the hills can certainly feel like an island.
No beach and no sun, but yeah, very isolated, which is one of the big takeaways from this. When there's any sort of disaster, climate disaster, or a local militia, or whatever it may be, it takes a huge amount of effort to reach that community. It was 2 winters ago, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that we had so much snow, Monarch Pass was actually closed for a day or 2 days.
It happens from time to time, sure. Avalanches.
So easy example of the Gunnison Valley actually being cut off from where our food is coming from. Mm-hmm. So an easy example of the need for food sovereignty, food security inside the Gunnison Valley, not within Colorado as a whole. So while we are connected through our infrastructure development, mm-hmm. there's still something about mountains that geographically separates us from our neighbors, and that's important to pay attention to.
Well, and there's something about the people who live in mountain areas.
Absolutely.
No matter where you go, there are some similarities. There's kind of a rugged individualism, right? People come to the mountains to get away, to do for themselves. Is that something that is being recognized in these efforts to pull mountain communities together in sort of a whole?
Absolutely. So I'll answer that in maybe a little bit of a roundabout way. I think we're all aware by now that suicide rates in mountain towns are above average. It's not proportionate.
Alarmingly above.
Alarmingly, yes. And while there's, again, a variety of issues that play into this, National Geographic had an article maybe 2 months ago addressing this. And one of the things they talked about is that these mountain communities do have these very rugged, independent people. And that whether it's biologically or socially, people who tend to be in mountain communities aren't cut from the same cloth as the rest of the culture, as our country, and maybe are more willing to address things in a very direct way or in an extreme way. And could be one of the reasons that we see this high suicide rate is that there's people who are just willing to address things,
their problems,
again
in the most
extreme way. But it's that same mindset that has people hucking flips off 40-footers, or rafting down anything they can. And,
right. There's an extreme is a word that we sort of value.
Absolutely.
In our cultural ethos in the mountains, but it may have a dark side.
It does, absolutely.
Which comes to your project, because you're focusing on storytelling, and that is going into these communities and looking at the hard data of the sorts of things that scientists would be interested in, but also listening. The kind of thing you learned in Fiji, actually, is from what I'm understanding.
Yeah.
Learning to listen and hear the stories. Why, out of all the things you could have studied for your graduate degree, why that? What is it about storytelling that appeals to you?
Well, I guess it has to come back first to my development ethic. To me, the most important things in life are freedom of choice and community. Anything that we're doing has to always be supporting those two things. In development, the way it's been done, the way it's being done, doesn't support that. Again, that's what I learned in Fiji. Even what I value, I wasn't valuing for others. Mm-hmm. In story, when you're listening to somebody's story, and you and I would agree on this, Alan, that a story isn't just a tale. It's not just people talking about nothing. There's a message to it. There's something behind that is coming alive in that moment with the words, with the actions. And when you can participate and listen to that, you can say, wow, I'm hearing what you value as a community. This was another lesson for me in Fiji, where Fijians communicate so indirectly that they actually use stories to tell you what to do.
As do so many people.
As do so many cultures. I remember this time, I asked one of my bosses, the guy running the agriculture school, I said, what do you need me to teach? What are you looking for here? And he told me the story about how this other community, it wasn't even Fijians, this other community, their island was being mined for phosphate, and so they were just mega wealthy. And they used to be these incredible fishermen. Everyone in the whole ocean knew about them and knew they could do anything. But when they had all this money, they stopped fishing. Fishermen would come up from other tribes, other villages, and they would just buy everything in the boat, right? And after a while, obviously, money ran out a few generations later. And so these fishermen by now have a habit of just coming up and selling all the fish they catch to this community. And they start noticing the community's getting a little pickier about the fish, right? And sending them away. And they think, what's going on, So the fishermen really try hard and they get these great fish and bring them to the community. And they say, oh, no, they're not very good. And they say, you're lying. These are the best fish we've caught this year. Why won't you buy them? And they said, oh, we don't have any more money. And they said, well, why are you still playing this game? Why don't you just go fish for yourself? And they said, we've lost it. We've lost our identity. We don't know how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So
we don't
I walked
know how
away
to build
from
boats anymore.
We don't know how to build boats. We don't know how to follow the fish. We don't know how to read the reefs, all of it. But this is the story he's telling me at an agriculture school. And so I walk away going, what is happening? What does he want me to do? But it was just simply a story about another people that had lost their identity and had lost the basic ability to provide for themselves. We were at an agriculture school teaching young boys how to go back into their heritage and farm in traditional ways. And once I could hear the meat, the gist, the core of this story, I was able to actually support that community in a way that they needed me to.
Well, and that is the power of story. That's what's been recognized over and over. Stories transmit meaning in ways that are palatable. If he had used ideological language, for instance, or a lot of jargon that you might not have understood, the meaning would have been lost.
Yeah.
But a story is universal.
Or what if he had just answered my question, Hey, what do you need me to do? Oh, I need you to teach the boys how we used to farm. I would have done it and we never would have talked about it again. And I wouldn't be sitting here 2 years later thinking back to this moment that really changed my entire concept of what development was.
Well, you wouldn't have a story to tell.
Yeah, exactly.
Because stories are also self-perpetuating. Here you are telling me this story that I never would have heard otherwise. And it's got a universal ring to it. In what ways is our culture right now dismantling our boats, forgetting how to make nets? These are things that we can think about now because we've got this imagery. So what do you plan to do then? Pick a representative mountain community. You want to go in there and sort of catalog the stories.
Sure.
How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so I'll go briefly back to the project to give some context. So the United Nations Mountain Partnership is an arm of the FAO charged with representing mountain communities across the globe. 6 different regions. Our region is North America, Central America, and the Caribbean. And there's a huge amount of mountain terrain in that area. 81 million people living in mountains in that region. Mm-hmm. So my project is using really a story arc, a story framework, a big story. So this is, a little shout out to you, Alan, on your own podcast. This is a concept that I took from you with literary theory, based in some of Joseph Campbell's work.
Right.
And saying a narrative arc is more than literature. That's a way that we can understand a community, that all this data we collect, whether it's economic growth, or if it's education rates, or gender equity, or
Soil health.
on and on and on, that those are all pieces of a story. You could call them maybe a character in the story of a community. And if we can understand those metrics, those singular points, as something that describes the whole, we don't lose the whole picture for a small piece. We build a stronger, a clearer picture of a community. So what I'm doing for my project is building this framework, this conceptual theory of how to approach development in these communities, how to represent them. There will be somebody who takes on this more quantitative part based on some Swiss mountain indicators. What I'll be doing, like you were asking, is going in and listening to stories, asking people in, actually tomorrow I leave for Puebla, Mexico. So going down to Puebla, Mexico and saying, hey, I'm here for a few weeks and I will never be a part of this place, but what do I need to do? Who do I need to talk to? What do I need to taste? What sights do I need to see? What sounds do I need to hear?
Who's playing the music that's been around for centuries?
Just a snippet of what this place is. Let's do it in Gunnison. If people are in Gunnison, hey, what do I need to see in Gunnison? Hey, you have to go out to Hartman's, right?
Mm-hmm.
Have you eaten at the Stash yet? These things that mean so much to the people here. And if we can, as a development community, can recognize that those things, the sense of place, the way a people express themselves individually and collectively, that those are a critical piece of development, we can allow that community to really charge their future. This is where we're going. And the United Nations Mountain Partnership can say, awesome, how can we help you?
That's an awesome goal. One thing I noticed, though, is you started off talking about metrics. Economic metrics, and we mentioned some of the biological things that you might measure in a community. But what you just got around to describing is all about people. It's all about lived experience and sort of an inherited heritage and history that is only stored in the stories of a place. Would you agree with that? And
Absolutely.
Is that what you're trying to get at?
Absolutely. So there's a saying in permaculture circles. It's a way of producing food that's in harmony with nature. Permaculture is. And there's a saying that the problem is the solution. So one of the ironies for me in the way that development has been done is particularly around climate change. Let's say, okay, climate change is happening. This is anthropogenic. This is human caused. We're going to look at economics as the root of it. Or we're going to look at soil health as the root of it. Instead of saying it's human caused, let's look at people. What are people needing? What are we driving? What's our search? Why don't we address what's causing everything else instead of addressing everything else? Let's get to the root of it.
And as the story you told from the man in Fiji would suggest, sometimes the answers aren't in the conversation that's directly about climate change at all.
No.
They're in how people see their relationship with the land, with each other, with indigenous deities. All of that plays a role. Do you think it's realistic, though, to ever expect people with a scientific method mindset, people with a policy mindset? And if you ever read a policy paper, you know that that's not storytelling.
Yeah, mind-numbing.
Do you think it's unrealistic to expect the nuances and the poetry and the music and the flavors of a place to ever make their way into that kind of conversation?
Absolutely. It's absolutely realistic. So imagine a spectrum, and on one end of the spectrum is let's say Western ways of understanding. And this is a pretty quick big brush, but Western hard science quantitative data. Mm-hmm. And on the other side would be storytelling and music and art and sense of place.
The way Bushmen store their heritage, for instance.
So what I'm trying to argue in this project isn't that Western ways of understanding are wrong. It's that they're incomplete. At the same time, I'm not trying to argue that traditional knowledge is the only way of knowing. I think that that's incomplete as well without this data way of thinking of things, statistical analysis, right? Academic rigor. Why can't we find the agreement between the two of those and say, really a marriage between these two? And as a married guy, tension between the two, with them pulling against each other. No, come this way. No, come back the other way. That's the sweet spot for development.
Well, that almost sounds like a maturing of development.
I would agree.
Development itself, on the scale that we practice it today, is actually a very young thing, right?
Right.
I have to reiterate, on the scale we practice it today. I mean, cultures have always gone in and built what they built. But they weren't able to, flood entire river basins by building one dam, for instance. And so it's okay that we've done it that way. And now maybe it's time to let that mellow, let that mature.
Absolutely. There's something to be said about well-intentioned mistakes. And we, as a development community, and maybe the scope here spanning the last several hundred years, right? We've made a lot of really well-intentioned bad decisions. And it's time to say, okay, we've done these things really trying to do the best and we haven't reached it. How can we humble ourselves, right? How can I be a Peace Corps volunteer again and say, I don't have the answers just because I have a grad degree, just because I'm white, male from America, whatever it is, that doesn't make me an authority. It makes me informed on one piece of the story, my community's story. How can I allow that community to speak? How can Gunnison give voice to Puebla, Mexico, to Panama, to Guatemala? How can we build connections there, sharing with one another, and really as a whole bring mountain communities and, as result, the globe into a healthier place?
Well, and I think the word maturity also implies a softening of polarity.
Yeah.
Because there are some people who would look at those who pursue development in the traditional sort of mindset and would actually go so far as to call that evil.
Absolutely.
And there are other people who would look at those who want to pay attention to the poetry and the music and the art and the cuisine of a place and call that naive.
Sure.
And so the more we can meet each other in the middle, the more we're likely to get done in a productive way.
It's nothing more than a renaissance of development, right? We've had science and art separated. And if we can bring them back together, I don't know anybody that does statistical analysis or is writing papers for the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I don't know anybody that does any of this hard quantitative stuff that doesn't want to hang out with their friends and have a beer and go biking.
Go to the movies.
Yeah. But somehow we separate these from each other and think that we're doing ourselves and our world a service by keeping life separate from life.
Well, I would like to think that as a result of your work, the human race is growing up a little.
that might be a little much.
Is that too much to put on your shoulders?
Yeah.
Well, at any rate, it's been a great conversation. Ethan, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely.
Think Radio is a production of Alan Wardis Media. To contact Alan, visit alanwardismedia.com.
The show's producer is Issa Forrest. Original music by Issa Forrest. Thanks for listening. Join us next week for another great conversation on Think Radio.